everyone to our second annual Queen's Faculty of Arts and Science Homecoming event. My name is Erica Mackwam, and I am the Associate Director of Development within the Faculty of Arts and Science. Through my work, I get the opportunity to meet and connect and engage with alumni and friends of Queen's University, and I'm so pleased to celebrate Homecoming 2021 today. As we gather today, I acknowledge that Queen's University is situated on Cataract Way, which is on the land of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe, home to more than 4,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people from across Turtle Island. I offer my respects to the peoples. Please consider your position, and I urge everyone to learn, to listen, and to understand the land that you're on and your personal relationship with it and the history that accompanies it. Now it's time to dive in. First, this session is being recorded and will be available in the replay section following this event. I wanted to give a quick shout out to all of the Faculty of Arts and Science alumni joining us here this morning. What a great turnout. I have to say though, I'm not surprised because nothing gets in the way of Queen's alumni celebrating homecoming, not even a pandemic. Let's talk about the plan for the hour we have together today. You'll have a chance to hear directly from our current Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Science, Dr. Barbara Crow, who's pleased to be here with you today to provide you with updates from the Faculty of Arts. Following Dean Crow's remarks, make sure you settle in and enjoy the reimagined version of our ever popular Last Lecture on Earth series. I'd actually love to see in the chat how many of you attended Last Lecture on Earth lectures on campus when you were here. The series today is with Dr. Rebecca Manley, Associate Professor and the Chair of the Department of History, as she delivers a short but highly engaging lecture about the evolution of the kitchen, which I'm actually standing in my kitchen here today, the widely accepted centerpiece of many homes. There will be opportunities to ask questions of both Dean Crow and Dr. Manley after their talks today. So please, if you want to ask any questions, put it in the Q&A section on the right-hand side of the screen, and we will monitor that closely. And don't forget, immediately following this event, alumni are invited to head over to our Coffee with the Dean booth in the expo session, where you'll have a chance to speak with Dean Crow directly and ask her any questions that you might have. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dean Barbara Crow. Dr. Crow was appointed the Dean of Arts and Science in Queen's University in 2017. She's responsible for overseeing operations of the Faculty of Arts and Science, including developing and supporting the faculty's long and short-term goals, policies, fundraising efforts, strategic initiatives, and academic priorities. Dr. Crow's research interests lie in the areas of feminism, aging, and technologies, and the way in which they intersect, and specifically the various impacts of digital technology. Prior to joining Queen's, Dr. Crow is the Associate Vice President and the Dean of the Faculty of Graduate Studies at York University. She holds a BAH in Political Science and Women's Studies and a Master's and PhD in Sociology. Welcome, Barbara. We're so thrilled to have you here with us today.
Great. Thank you so much, Erica. And hello, Elvin. So nice to see that you were out here. So good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of the alumni who have joined us for today's event. And I want to do a big shout out to our alumni team here at Kingston and to Erica and Colleen, who have done a wonderful job, and to thank our interpreters who are going to be with us today, Ashley Upton and Jamie Kwan. So welcome. Who knew that we would be doing another homecoming during a pandemic? None of us ever imagined it. And I can share with you that it's raining here in Kingston, so it might have just as been as well that we're doing this virtually today. And it's great to hear where all of you are from. So please send in the chat and let us know where you're from today. And this is one of the wonderful things about doing this virtually, is that people from far away are able to join us. So what I'm going to do today with you is just kind of give you an update on the Faculty of Arts and Science, because I know some of you are coming back for your reunions, and what it's been like, what the faculty is like, and what we've been doing. And I'll talk about some of the things that we've done during the pandemic. And I too am joining you from my kitchen in solidarity with Rebecca's talk. Professor Manley is a wonderful colleague who chairs our Department of History. So what I'd like to do is, I've got a bit of a presentation and I'll talk through what's happening in the Faculty of Arts and Science. So the first slide. Well, this is what our campus looks like right now. We have been very excited by the fact that we received provincial exemptions to bring our students back on campus. And I'm proud to say that Queen's, Western, U of T downtown, and Trent have brought the most students back of any of the universities in the province of Ontario. And I want you to know that our students are incredibly, incredibly happy on being on campus. And so are our staff and faculty. It is just something else. And the energy on campus has just been like nothing else. It's been really, really exciting. Our students, staff, and faculty have been highly compliant around the regulations that allow us to bring so many people back on campus. Almost up to 98% of our students, staff, and faculty are vaccinated. Students wear masks in class. There's hand sanitizers everywhere, and we have not had any transmission of COVID to date. And I'm so excited about our colleagues and how we've been working together to deliver this in-person experience. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk to you about a number of things, and I hope that you were able to hear Principal Dean and Justice Sinclair. We're thrilled that our new Chancellor is Justice Sinclair. But the Principal launched a really important conversation when he arrived here a couple of years ago, and we're now in the process of operationalizing and putting into place his vision, and I would argue his really important moral leadership. And in his conversation, he has been deeply committed to the care and research and teaching like all principals should be. But aside from his appointment of Justice Sinclair, we also ranked first in the Times Higher Education on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This is just amazing, and it's an opportunity for us, after 150 years of Queen's, to once again put our arms around who we are, what we're about, and how we want to engage with the next 150 years. The next issue, and I've given you some updates, but I just wanted to share with you around COVID-19. On March 13th in 2020, we moved all of our courses online. This was tremendous, and you'll see why when I start talking about what arts and science looks like today. We put 807 courses and delivered 55,000 enrollments online last year. This was incredible. Our students, our faculty, our staff demonstrated what makes universities so exciting and powerful and important institutions around their creativity, their innovation, their problem-solving skills. And as I said to you now, this year we're back in person, and we have about 15% of our curriculum being offered online for international students and for some of our students who were unable to make it back on campus. We've also developed some really exciting student support that have emanated from the principal's conversation and from our amazing Vice Provost in Student Services, Ann Tierney, Promise and Commitment Scholars that are about diversifying our student population, but also supporting our students and putting the supports around them so that they succeed from year 1 through year 4. And I strongly encourage you to click on those links and meet the amazing young students who are attending our university, and very much from much of your support for them to be here. Of course, mental health, huge, significant issue. And during COVID, I was really fortunate to have Dr. Wendy Craig, who's a member of the Order of Canada, and also the head of PrevNet. Her research is in the area of bullying. She approached me and said, "Hey, Barbara, are you doing any assessment and evaluation of your team's response to COVID?" We were so thick in the weeds of doing that, assessing and evaluating our response was not high on our list. Anyway, she brought in what I think, again, is fantastic about the university, a group of graduate students who followed us throughout the year and made a whole series of recommendations, many of those around how to improve and engage with well-being and wellness in more significant and more meaningful ways. And then finally, global engagement. How do we engage with the global at home, but also the ways in which technology have facilitated different kinds of ways us to communicate, like today, where many of us can come from around the world. And so the ways in which we're thinking about how do we engender, facilitate, enhance these kinds of ways. And I'm very excited. We appointed a special advisor to the Dean, Amitabh Chaudhary, who is working on putting together Queen's Global Summer, and we're very excited about offering programming during the summer that's focusing, will focus on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and some other climate change and sustainability issues. All right, next slide. So this is what arts and science looks like. It is pretty incredible. For some of you, I don't know when the last time you were here, but we have almost 15,000 students. We're the size of a mid-sized university. We make up 60% of the university. In the country, there are about a dozen faculty of arts and science left, and I think this is an incredible value added that students can come into first year and have a panoply of arts and science programming available to them to see where they might want to go, and also to have access to this curriculum as they move through their undergraduate years. We had the highest rates of application to date to Queen's. It was 88 to get in to the university. 76% of our students come from Ontario. So this just gives you an idea of the scope and scale of the Faculty of Arts and Science, and it's a big part of the university. Next slide, please. I also think it's important to look at how the undergraduate enrollments have changed, and you can see over time, from 1960 to 2000, almost 68% of our undergraduate enrollment are women. So huge group of women, a real shift in the demographics of our student population. Next slide, please. Another one that some of you may be interested in as alumni is looking at our tuition. And you can see that over the last 20 years, we've had significant increases in our tuition, and in particular, our international tuition. Next slide, please. Our international enrollments, Principal Daniel Wolf was deeply committed to internationalizing and globalizing our campus and made significant efforts to increase our international student population. And you can see that we have increased that number substantially. And unfortunately, many of our international students have been impacted by travel, vaccination policies, and we really are hoping that next year we're going to see them as much in person as we can. Next slide, please. Faculty hiring. I've been incredibly fortunate to be part and parcel of hiring over 160 new faculty, and 70% have been in equity deserving groups. So this has been our faculty profile very much reflects the Canadian population and the changes in our student demographics. Next slide, please. Great, also renewal. And then I just thought it would be interesting for you to see what our organization, what our faculty had to do to deliver during the pandemic. We had 92 department embedded support people. We also had our arts and science online that we could draw on. But just to let you know, just the scope and scale of how our organization had to respond to deliver during the pandemic. And we're just in the process, again, of assessing some of the ways in which we have been able to benefit from hybrid and remote learning, and then also some of the ways students deeply, deeply want the in-person experience, as well as our faculty and staff. Next slide, please. All right, we had to deal with provincial cuts with the 2018, and that was a significant loss in revenue. We had a 10% tuition cut, and we have not been able to increase our tuition. There was a cut to the Ontario student assistance program, and as well, we had an opt-out for student organizations, and this was a significant amount of work for the Undergraduate Student Arts and Science Undergraduate Student Association, the Graduate Student Association, and Alma Mater Society. And a lot of work went into our student organizations and rethinking how we support some elements of arts and science in the university that are critical to the Queen's experience. Next slide, please. So we launched a strategic plan, one of the first in the 150-year history of the Faculty of Arts and Science, and not unlike what we want to see happen in most universities, but of course to strengthen our research, enrich the student experience, support our people, and transform our places. And I'm really excited to say that midway through, we're 35% of the way through, despite COVID, and it's been a very important document for shaping the direction and where we want to go and how to help us make some really difficult decisions. Next slide, please. So in terms of alumni recommendations, you're here today, and what are the ways in which you can support arts and science? We have Life After Arts Sci, which has been an excellent initiative on part of the Dean's Advisory Council I work with about networking our amazing students with our incredible alumni. It's been a tremendously successful event. It could be bigger. So if you're interested in mentoring or networking, or last year, students went and visited a number of our alumni workplaces and had a great time seeing what those spaces, those range of spaces are like, and also finding out a number of alumni who worked in those organizations. There's a program called MyTax. The federal government has been exceptionally generous in funding this program that provides matching funds for organizations to hire a student, undergraduate or graduate. And I can share with you, UBC and U of T have thousands. We're only at the hundreds. I'm very interested in those who'd be interested in that. To contribute to our student bursaries, it's been very challenging for our students right now, and always important the ways in which we can provide financial support. And then we have a number of mental health and wellness initiatives, and happy to discuss those and the ways in which we're trying to attend to well-being within the faculty. So next slide. I think those, if you have any questions, and very, very happy to see all of you here. And otherwise, we may just be time to go to Professor Manley's lecture.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that. I think we're going to actually have time for one question. So I'm going to ask you a question here now. Can you highlight one or two of the initiatives that you're most proud of since you've been the dean here at the Faculty of Arts?
Wow, what a great question. And shout out to Mark Green. Our provost is here. Thanks, Mark, for that shout out. Geez, what am I most proud of? I'm most proud of probably three things, and I'll talk about them in relation to students, staff, and faculty. We've done tremendous work to develop a community assembly to incorporate staff in our strategic plan in a way a number of universities have not, and I'm really proud of the way in which we've acknowledged staff. I am really proud of the strong relationship our faculty has with our Undergraduate Student Association, and we've had exceptional leaders in that space. And I'm really proud of the hiring that we've been able to do to invigorate research, teaching, and service. And it's been so important to our colleagues to have a new generation of scholars to work with. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much to everybody for your questions, and thank you, Barbara, for those insights. I know your innovative leadership style has been so critical over the last 2 years for all staff, students, faculty, and administration as we've had to evolve in this crazy pandemic time.
Yeah, thanks, Erica.
So, you're welcome. It is now my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Rebecca Manley, Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of History here at Queen's. Rebecca specializes in Russian and Soviet history. She is a published and award-winning author, along with teacher and researcher here at Queen's, who is currently working on a book-length project on hunger in modern Russian history. She teaches a range of courses in modern European and Russian history 246, the Soviet experiment. Rebecca was awarded the Departmental Award in Excellence in Teaching and the Department of History in both 2009 and 2015, which speaks to how much Rebecca's students enjoy her lectures. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for coming, and to the Faculty of Arts and Science and our interpreters for making this possible. My lecture today focuses on a space with which we are all intimately familiar, the kitchen. Over the past year and a half, most of us have spent a lot of time in our kitchens. At times, we've experienced our kitchen as a refuge from the pandemic, a safe space where we could experiment with sourdough starters, consume food without concern. At other times, we've felt trapped in our kitchens, isolated from extended family and friends, and confined to endless hours of cooking and cleaning, from which there sometimes seemed no escape. Even in our pre-pandemic lives, the kitchen could assume multiple guises. It could be a site of conviviality or of conflict. This lecture invites you to leave your own kitchen behind and to consider the politics of the kitchen in a time and a place when the institution itself was called into question. My topic is the Soviet kitchen. In some ways, the entire history of the Russian Revolution, of the Soviet experiment, can be told through the prism of this single space. Utopian dreams, terror, and dissent all played out in a drama involving pots and pans and kitchen tables. It's a Soviet story, but like any good history, it also speaks to contemporary concerns. The story of the Soviet kitchen highlights the politics of our domestic spaces and alerts us to the fact that the kitchen generates much more than food. Next slide, please. From the very earliest days of the Russian Revolution, the kitchen emerged as a battleground, a site of political contestation and competing visions of the socioeconomic order. Lenin and the Bolshevik Party had seized power in Russia in 1917 with the radical goal of transforming the erstwhile Russian Empire into the first communist country in the world. And the construction of communism, in their eyes, required not simply changes in the political and economic order, but also changes in daily life, changes to domestic relations. There was no space that attracted more attention in this regard than the kitchen. In the first 15 years of the revolution, the kitchen was subjected to a sustained and coordinated assault. The slogan, "Down with kitchen slavery," or "Down with the kitchen," was emblazoned on posters and propagated in political pamphlets. Next slide, please. It also featured in stories, such as the one cited here. "We must remake our whole life down to the kitchen pot," the narrator proclaims. "Down with the kitchen. We shall destroy this little domestic penitentiary." As this text and the accompanying illustration suggests, neither the kitchen nor the kitchen's implements were conceived as neutral. The illustration pictures a woman cowering in the midst of a menacing array of kitchen pots and implements. It points to what was undoubtedly the Bolsheviks' most pointed critique of the kitchen. The kitchen was a penitentiary for women. This argument was articulated by none other than Lenin himself in the midst of the Civil War. Next slide. Women's emancipation, he argued, would never be achieved through legal means alone. "Notwithstanding all the laws emancipating women," he wrote, "she continues to be a domestic slave." What was the source of women's slavery? It was petty housework, which, in Lenin's words, crushes, strangles, stultifies, and degrades her, chains her to the kitchen and the nursery. Barbarously unproductive, housework held women back from socially useful labor, labor that would yield benefits not just for the household, but for all of society, and that would in turn allow women to realize their own potential as productive human beings. And I think this message is very nicely conveyed in the poster displayed on this slide, in which a woman would be emancipated only when they freed themselves from the pots and pans, crushing them, enabling them to rise up and join together with other women in productive, meaningful labor. Next slide. In freeing women from the kitchen, the Bolsheviks aspired not only to replace household drudgery but with productive labor, but also to fundamentally transform relations between men and women, husbands and wives. Alexandra Kollontai, pictured here, the most famous female theorist among the Bolshevik leadership, argued that as long as women fulfilled an economic function within the household, and more particularly within the kitchen, true love would not be possible. "The separation of the kitchen from marriage," she wrote, "is no less important than the separation of church from state." Now, it was one thing to criticize the kitchen, but quite another to dispense with it. People needed to be fed. And indeed, as some of you may know, the revolution was in no small measure propelled by demands for and promises for bread. The old, outmoded kitchen, the domestic penitentiary, was slated for elimination. What would replace it? Next slide. In the wake of the revolution, Bolshevik theorists, planners, and architects set out to reimagine residential architecture and the spaces of food production and consumption. Inspired by a long tradition of European utopian thought and by Charles Fourier, pictured here, Soviet planners proposed a new type of dwelling, the House Commune. Like the phalanstery, pictured here, designed by Fourier 100 years earlier, the House Commune was a collective living complex. It was designed to transform daily life and social relations by remaking the spaces in which people lived. And in effect, activities that were formerly accommodated within the individual dwelling, activities like cooking, eating, childcare, study, leisure, those would all be transferred to communal spaces. As one Soviet economist put it, the new houses should not have separate apartments with kitchens, pantries, etc. for individual domestic use, since all of the workers' everyday needs will be completely socialized. The House Commune would thus serve as an incubator for the new society. By eliminating space for private family life, the House Commune would help forge a new collective family of workers. Now, in these designs, the private individual kitchen would be replaced by the factory kitchen and its corollary, the collective canteen. As the name suggests, factory kitchen, the factory kitchen was modeled on industrial production. In the factory kitchen, machines would accomplish in minutes tasks that women had labored in their dark and dirty domestic kitchens over for hours. The same story that lampooned the kitchen as a little domestic penitentiary, next slide, saw in the factory kitchen the potential for a veritable revolution in food production. We shall force machines to peel potatoes, wash the dishes, cut the bread, stir the soup, make the ice cream. The meals prepared in factory kitchens would be consumed collectively in canteens. Next slide. Now, eating has always been about more than physical sustenance. The breaking of bread is not only a material act, it's a very symbolic act as well. In the canteen, workers would break their bread together, forging new bonds of community and solidarity. In replacing the domestic kitchen with the collective canteen, Soviet planners would thus supplant the individual family, long the basic unit of society, with the collective family of workers. Next slide. This slide pictures one of the most famous house communes that was actually built in the Soviet Union in the late 1920s, a residence for the Ministry of Finance, Narkomfin. In the photograph, you can see the large communal block of the building, which housed the factory kitchen, the dining room, and spaces for leisure and study. The communal space was attached to the residential spaces by the covered bridge, which you see there. Next slide. The residential units of this building were conceived in some ways as transitional units. Children were still housed with their parents, so this was not one of the most radical designs, but the space of private family life was very much reduced. Instead of an individual kitchen, apartments were created with what they called kitchen nooks, and one is pictured here. A report on the project describing these nooks referred to them as a nod in the direction of the old domestic arrangements, and reassured readers that, if desired, the whole kitchen element may be tossed out in favor of public dining. Getting rid of this kitchen element proved to be more difficult than anticipated. Scarce resources prevented the large-scale construction of dwellings like this Narkomfin building. While factory kitchens and canteens proliferated, they were never built on a scale sufficient to supplant the individual kitchen. Through most of Soviet history, Soviet citizens could count on these collective institutions for at most one meal a day. The rest would need to be consumed at home. Home, however, had also changed in the wake of the revolution. Next slide. Even if Soviet citizens were not, for the most part, living in house communes like the Narkomfin building, they were living communally in a new institution that came to characterize Soviet urban life, the communal apartment, or kommunalka. The communal apartment bore very little resemblance to Fourier's phalanstery or to the large-scale projects imagined by Soviet planners. Nonetheless, it came to represent a specifically Soviet brand of communism. A product of Bolshevik social policy, the communal apartment was born of a meeting of utopian vision and a desperate shortage of housing. Eager to ameliorate the condition of the working class, the Bolsheviks passed a decree. Excess living space in the apartments of the cities, in the lavish and well-appointed apartments of urban elites, would be requisitioned and redistributed to workers. The former owners were compelled, in the parlance of the day, to self-compress. Now, what did this mean? This meant, in effect, that if you had a 4-bedroom apartment, your whole family would move into 1 bedroom. Another worker's family or another family would be moved into one of the other bedrooms. The dining room would be requisitioned for yet another family, the study for another, etc. The bathroom, the corridors, and most importantly, the kitchen would be communal, to be shared by all the apartment's inhabitants. Next slide. A Russian journalist and food writer recently described the Soviet communal kitchen as a war zone. It was, in the words of a former communal apartment resident, a domestic Nagorno-Karabakh, and that's a reference to the region of Azerbaijan that has been a source of fighting and conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Imagine the scene. Multiple people forced to share one communal cooking space. Now, for some of you, this may evoke nostalgic memories of your years in student housing here in Kingston. But the kitchen of the communal apartment was a far cry from the shared kitchen of most student housing. For a start, the kitchen was shared not by multiple individuals, a group of friends, but by multiple families. Each, moreover, had their own cooking implement, their own cupboard to store pots and pans, their own food storage units, and their own table. Cleaning duties were divided by family and transcribed on a duty schedule affixed to the wall. Sinks had to be shared, and there were often time slots for these shared appliances. As one historian of the communal apartment has concluded, the potential for friction was unending. Tension in the communal kitchen was the norm, making it a rich source for writers who satirized the way the communal apartment bred not collectivism, as it was intended to do, but rather conflict. Tensions erupted over the seemingly smallest trifles. In satirist Mikhail Zoshenko's story, part of which is cited here, the fight he references erupted after one resident used another's brush to clean his stove. The kitchen presented endless sources for conflict, but it also presented a host of ways beyond physical brawls to take revenge. A conflict between 2 women ended with one woman pouring dirty slops into the other's saucepan of macaroni. Now, conflict and contestation are, of course, not unique to the communal kitchen. But in the context of the Soviet Union, such conflicts could be dangerous, resulting not only in arguments or brawls or spoiled macaroni, but in formal denunciations. Denunciations were encouraged in the Soviet Union, particularly under Stalin, who ruled the country from the late 1920s until his death in 1953. During the Stalinist terror, which reached its apogee at the end of the 1930s, residents turned on their neighbors by the thousands, denouncing them for not following communal rules, for theft, for drunkenness, and most ominously, for anti-Soviet sentiments, a critical word that they carelessly let slip in the communal spaces of the kitchen. As one commentator said of the communal kitchen, during the Stalin era, it was the most dangerous place to be. Well, the communal apartment survived Stalin and indeed even the collapse of the Soviet Union. My first trip to Moscow for dissertation research, I lived in a communal apartment, and this was post-Soviet. But by the 1960s, the individual kitchen had made a comeback. Next slide. To be sure, it had never entirely disappeared. Even in the House Commune of the Narkomfin building, the building for the Ministry of Finance, the minister himself had built his own private kitchen in the penthouse suite, pictured here, allowing him to skip meals in the collective canteen. The architect who designed the building and visited it a few years after it was built also noted that many families went to the canteen to get their meals, but they brought them back up to their apartments to consume in the privacy of their own kitchen nooks. By the 1960s, the Soviet state had retreated from its most radical projects and had reconciled itself to the fact that the kitchen was likely here to stay, at least for the time being. Next slide. In a now famous debate between American Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, set in a model kitchen at the American Exhibition in Moscow in 1959 and pictured here, the United States had sought to present the American kitchen as evidence of capitalism's superiority. Khrushchev, instead of rejecting the notion or the idea of the individual family kitchen, claimed that the Soviet Union would soon surpass the United States. Next slide. New residential buildings constructed under Khrushchev to alleviate the housing crisis were designed for the individual nuclear family, and they invariably, albeit somewhat reluctantly, contained kitchens. The kitchens in the Khrushchev-era apartments were designed for women, but the state did try to distinguish them from the domestic penitentiaries of the past. The new Soviet kitchen would rationalize and optimize kitchen work, conserving time and energy and affording ample opportunity, at least in theory, for Soviet women to find fulfillment in both labor and leisure outside the home. The chaotic assortment of pots and pans that previously signaled women's domestic oppression would be reordered according to scientific principles, bringing the individual kitchen and the woman who worked in it into Soviet modernity. Now, the individual kitchens built under Khrushchev en masse may have served to modernize household cookery, but they also served to reinforce the reliance on women's uncompensated labor, contributing to the double burden that increasingly defined the lives of Soviet women. If pots and pans continued to chain women to the kitchen, however, many Soviet women nonetheless took comfort in the fact that in their individual kitchens, they only had to contend with their pots and pans and not those of their neighbors. The spaces that we inhabit shape our lives in a multiplicity of ways, not always the ways that were intended by those who designed them. The individual kitchen in the Khrushchev-era apartment was designed first and foremost as a workspace, compact and efficient. But the kitchen under Khrushchev quickly evolved into a social space, indeed the central social space of the individual apartment. Next slide. Cramped quarters meant that living rooms in these new apartments always doubled as bedrooms, leaving only the kitchen for entertaining. The kitchen was, in the words of musician Yuli Kim, a tea house, a pie house, a pancake house, a study, a gambling dive, a living room, a parlor, a ballroom, a salon for a passing by drunkard, a home for a visiting bard to crash for a night. This is a Moscow kitchen, he wrote. This is how subversive thought grew and expanded in the Soviet Union, beginning with free discussion at the kitchen. As Kim's recollections suggest, the kitchen was a space for socializing and for talk, for free discussion. Indeed, there was even a term used to designate these conversations, kitchen talk. Around the kitchen table, friends and family could gather with no fears of nosy neighbors and denunciations. Not all kitchen talk, of course, was subversive, but by its very nature, it fostered a more intimate form of sociability, distinct from, separated from, Soviet official public culture. Next slide. The kitchen thus became the site of an alternative kitchen culture, what some referred to ironically in the Soviet Union as a kitchen salon. It was around the kitchen table that many members of the intelligentsia read and discussed hand-typed copies of manuscripts that had been banned by the Soviet state. And if you read memoirs, you can find accounts of people reading Dr. Zhivago in their friend's kitchen, a family gathering in their kitchen to read Alexander Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago through the night. The kitchen, thus, once targeted for elimination, had become, by the end of the Soviet era, a hotbed of dissent. Some of you will notice I've delivered this lecture with only scant mention of food. Tragically, this is one respect in which the story of the Soviet kitchen ended much as it had begun, with not enough to eat. And this is but one of the ways in which the Soviet experiment with socialism can be deemed a failure. Another is, of course, the liberation of women. Pots and pans were reordered and redeployed, but they remained firmly in the hands of women. Nonetheless, the story of the Soviet kitchen also offers glimmers of hope. for those interested in interrogating the power relations and inequalities that structure our domestic space. The critique articulated in the early Soviet era provides, if not a blueprint, then at least food for thought. And as we now all emerge from our extended pandemic-imposed isolation, the story of the Soviet kitchen reminds us of the power of face-to-face conversations in the casual spaces of our kitchen, of kitchen talk, to reconstitute community. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Rebecca. That was so much fun to listen to. Your comment about the ways that some things affect us in different ways than they're designed to. I'm sure many of our Queen's alumni joining us today can say that about their experience even coming to Queen's as a student and how it probably shaped their life. Do you have any additional comments to add about just this pandemic life? We've all been spending lots of time in our kitchen, and do you see yourself in the future sort of researching this new wave of how we're spending time and how it's kind of changed and shaped our life today?
Well, I think it's an interesting moment. I'm one of those people who did experiment with sourdough starters and kefir and yogurt making and all of these other things in the kitchen. And as I revisit this material, you know, especially about sort of trying to liberate women from the kitchen, I'm cognizant of the fact that we're in a very different moment in many ways from that sort of 20th century moment, thinking that technology was going to solve all of our problems. And in so many ways, we look to our kitchens now, not just for, you know, family, for community, but also to craft new kind of sustainable practices of, you know, for food security. The kitchen has emerged as an important site. And I think that, so I think it's a very different moment in some respects, and yet these critiques, I think, are still very much relevant.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I remember hearing, I don't know if it was Hillary Clinton or some famous woman politician in the United States in an interview once saying that they have a family rule in their, like after dinner, nobody is allowed to leave until she left the kitchen, because she would always get left with like doing the final wipe down and all of those kind of additional kitchen duties that even though people feel like they're contributing, it was still falling on her. So I think this is definitely very relevant.
Right. Interesting. It's I see a question. I don't know if I'm allowed to. A question in the chat
Yes,
about
please.
who peeled Lenin's potatoes. Question from my colleague and alumnus. It's interesting that the Bolsheviks, these early Bolsheviks, Lenin and Kollontai, they very much tried to live this idea of changing the family and changing the kitchen in their own lives. And so they were very keen to rethink how kitchen work was done, and yet it was always women still who did the work. And so it was a matter of trying to make that work that was seen and compensated rather than to changing who actually did the work.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Okay, I don't see any more questions. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us today. That was fascinating. So this really concludes our formal agenda for today. And before you leave, we want to just share with you some of the other arts and science specific information and content available for today. So if you head on over to the expo session of the platform, and if you filter by Faculty of Arts and Science at the top, you'll notice a wide variety of content. There's videos highlighting interesting research happening at Queen's. We have updates from our students and what life is like on campus right now, which is really cool to see. An exciting trivia game where you have a chance to win a prize, and maybe you can beat some of your fellow alumni in that challenge. And finally, there's a chance to leave a message to the class of 2022 on our memory board. Finally, we are going to be heading over to Coffee with the Dean booth in the expo session directly following this chat. And so we hope to see you over there, and that's also in expo. Thank you again to Dean Crow and Rebecca Manley for joining us today and for making this portion of Queen's Homecoming 2021 extra special. If you're an alumni or friend out there who would like to talk to us more about how you can get involved or learn more about additional things going on in the Faculty of Arts and Science, please feel free to just send me this app anytime today. We can either chat today or we can set up a future time to talk. Happy to do that. Thank you to all of you, our attendees, for joining and for not letting anything get in the way of us celebrating homecoming. Thank you so much and have a fantastic day.